Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in New Mexico. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1871, and the territory of New Mexico lay in a hush between storms. The Civil War was years behind, yet its echoes carried on in the cracked towns scattered across the desert. At the edge of one such town, Las Cruces, a settlement barely holding together under the weight of dust and rumor, stood a crooked structure with a sun-faded sign that read, Blood Moon Saloon. The place was older than it looked. County tax records listed a prior name, El Cielo Tavern, established by a trader named Don Tomas Valdez in 1849. After his death, the property changed hands 5 times in 2 decades. Each new owner added something: a longer bar, a back room, a cellar cut into the earth. Yet none stayed long. By the spring of 1871, the saloon belonged to a man who introduced himself simply as Elias Finch. Witnesses later described him as the kind that smiles without warmth. He rode into town alone, bought the property in cash, and within days, Blood Moon Saloon was open again, its windows blacked with soot, its oil lamps burning long after the others in town went dark. A local ranch hand, Moses Cardillo, wrote in his pocket diary, "The new man don't drink what he sells. He sits with his back to the mirror, eyes like he's counting the folks still breathing." At first, no one thought much of it. The saloon drew drifters, traders, and soldiers heading south. It was a place for whiskey and dice. The smell of gun oil and sweat thick in the air. But then came the stories, the first quiet disappearances. A woman named Ruth Garrison, who worked serving drinks, was last seen stepping into the back corridor after closing. The next morning, her shawl was found hanging on a nail, but she was gone. Finch claimed she'd left for Santa Fe. The marshal filed no report. 3 weeks later, a pair of prospectors vanished on their way east. Their horses were found tied near the saloon, reins looped neatly, as though waiting for their riders to return. That summer, the Lincoln County War had not yet erupted, but tensions in the region already ran high. Rival cattle interests, corrupt lawmen, and an unspoken understanding that certain men could not be questioned. Finch seemed to fit into that silence perfectly. According to an 1894 affidavit from Deputy Thomas Leland, who later revisited the site, there were whispers of blood drawn not for whiskey nor for gold. Some said Finch fed on fear itself, and that he kept what he took. No evidence was ever filed. Only a few surviving notes, blurred by age and humidity, remain in the county archives. What set this story apart, however, was what the next owner of Blood Moon Saloon claimed to find buried beneath the cellar floor, a discovery that would haunt New Mexico's frontier legends for decades. When Deputy Leland first spoke of the discovery beneath the Blood Moon Saloon, he was already an old man. His recollection came in fragments, recorded in a series of interviews with the Las Cruces County Register around 1894. The saloon itself had long been shuttered, the roof half collapsed, windows boarded with warped pine. But what he described beneath it, what he said he saw by lantern light, still stains the legend of that town. The building, he claimed, had been sold again in 1874 to a former cavalry sergeant named Robert Yancey, who'd retired after the war with half a pension and a habit of collecting curiosities. Yancey intended to make the Blood Moon Saloon respectable, a place for traveling merchants instead of drifters. He hired workers to clean and dig out the old storage cellar. They expected to find broken bottles, maybe rat bones. Instead, they found the floor was layered with ash. Beneath it lay a shallow pit, no more than 4 feet deep, lined with what appeared to be discarded clothing, rusted belt buckles, and a tarnished locket containing the faded portrait of a young woman. Yancey ordered the men to stop digging until the sheriff arrived. But by nightfall, word had already spread through town. Some said bones were found, others swore the ash was mixed with something heavier. The official record, now preserved in the county archive, states only unverified human remains, possibly cremated, investigation postponed due to jurisdictional uncertainty. The matter was quietly dropped within a week. No marshal came. Yancey kept the saloon open for a few months before leaving town altogether. The earliest surviving article to mention the Blood Moon Saloon appeared in the Santa Fe Gazette, March 1875. It read, "A peculiar establishment, once belonging to one Elias Finch, has been subject of idle gossip in Las Cruces. Locals report sensations of uniaos, seeing drafts of cold air from beneath the floorboards, though no cause has been found." By then, Finch himself had vanished. No bill of sale, no burial record, no known kin. The only physical trace attributed to him was a silver-handled Colt revolver, engraved with a crescent moon, later recovered from a pawn office in Tucson, 1879. The pawnbroker claimed the man who sold it spoke little and had eyes like winter glass. Around the same period, the first rumblings of conflict that would become the Lincoln County War began to stir. Merchants, ranchers, and gunmen forming uneasy alliances across southern New Mexico. Finch's name was occasionally mentioned in letters intercepted from those years, though never as a participant. Rather, he seemed to drift through the background of other men's violence, like a shadow with no allegiance. A local priest, Father Joaquin Ortega, noted in his parish journal, "The saloon is cursed by memory alone. When storms come, the wind through its cracks makes a sound like someone drawing breath." By the late 1880s, the Blood Moon Saloon was reduced to little more than a landmark for travelers, the haunted ruin on the edge of town. Children dared each other to run past it after sundown. Adults avoided it entirely. What no one realized then was that the discovery under the floor was only part of the truth. Deeper within the earth, concealed behind a bricked wall, there were signs of another chamber, one never entered in Yancey's time. And according to one faded map found decades later in a county ledger room, the entrance to that chamber was marked not by a cross, but by a moon carved in soot. The ledger map that hinted at the hidden chamber was discovered in 1903 by a clerk named Harold Densmore, who had been tasked with reorganizing the aging county archives after a fire damaged several record boxes. Among the brittle pages, Densmore found a folded sheet marked with ink so faded it was almost invisible. When held under lamplight, a faint sketch appeared, the outline of the Blood Moon Saloon's foundation, with a small crescent symbol drawn beneath its western wall. Densmore, unsure of its meaning, sent a copy to the Santa Fe Historical Society, where it was filed under Unverified Local Plans, 1870 to 1880. His attached note read, "Possible reference to smuggling cellar or ritual chamber. Further inspection recommended if building remains accessible." By then, the saloon had already fallen into ruin. Only the foundation stones and part of the wooden frame still stood. Desert vines and tumbleweed had grown through its cracked floorboards, but a schoolteacher named Marjorie Lane, traveling through Las Cruces in 1905, took an interest in the story after hearing locals whisper about the feeding gunslinger. She recorded her interviews in a small journal later recovered by her nephew in the 1940s. Lane's notes describe her visit to the site. "The wind moved through it like water through hollow bone. I saw the remains of a stair descending into blackness, but the air that came out was colder than I thought possible in daylight." She claimed to have entered the first cellar, describing the same shallow pit that Yancey's workers once found. But Lane also noted a bricked wall at the far end, its mortar blackened as if burned. In the center of the wall, she saw a crescent-shaped mark, soot-stained, perfectly symmetrical. She wrote, "It looked touched by hands that did not wish to be seen." The Historical Society's report confirms that her account reached them, but no record suggests they ever followed up. A marginal note, penned decades later by an archivist, reads only, "Unsubstantiated, possibly influenced by tales surrounding the Lincoln County conflicts." Yet there's reason to believe the connection was more than coincidence. During the early years of the Lincoln County War, itinerant gunmen passed through Las Cruces en route to various factions, regulators, mercenaries, and bounty riders. Finch's description matches several unsolved killings between 1871 and 1874, in which victims were found drained of color, their skin cold, even under desert sun. Newspapers blamed cholera. Witnesses disagreed. A surviving letter from one Dr. Elias Browning, a field surgeon during that era, mentions tending to a wounded man outside White Oaks who bore the look of a man hollowed from within. Browning added, "He spoke the name Finch before losing sense, saying only, 'He drinks what frightens men.'" Marjorie Lane's journal ends abruptly after her final entry, dated June 10, 1905. She wrote that she planned to return to the site at night to see what the moon reveals. She was never heard from again. Her traveling bag and notebook were recovered from a coach station 20 miles east, but she herself vanished without trace. Local rumor claimed she had seen the other chamber, that the mark of soot opened when touched under moonlight. But no record supports that claim. The only evidence lies in her words, that feeling of air too cold for the season and the smell of metal that came from nowhere. By 1910, the Blood Moon Saloon had collapsed entirely. Yet what remained beneath, sealed in dust and darkness, would resurface one final time when railroad expansion crews struck something hard while cutting through the old town perimeter. The Southern Pacific expansion reached the outskirts of Las Cruces in 1910, bringing crews of laborers, surveyors, and engineers to clear the remaining debris of what had once been the town's western quarter. Among the mounds of adobe dust and sun-whitened beams stood the last vestiges of the Blood Moon Saloon, a skeletal frame leaning against the sky, its cellar long forgotten. According to project logs preserved by the Railway Commission of New Mexico, the discovery occurred in early September. A foreman named George M. Thacker reported that his crew's spades struck a stone partition, blackened, brittle, and not aligned to any known foundation plan. When they tried to break through, a hollow cavity behind it exhaled what one worker later described as a breath colder than underground snow. Thacker, being a practical man, assumed they had hit an old smuggling cache. He sent for a local sheriff's deputy to witness the opening. The report that followed, signed only Deputy H.R., was brief but chilling. Beneath western wall of former tavern was located sealed chamber, 10 feet deep, 4 feet wide. Interior coated with soot. Contents consisted of 3 wooden chairs, 1 iron basin, fragments of rope, and a ledger rendered unreadable by moisture, foul odor persistent, non-animal. The chamber was resealed within hours, at the sheriff's request, pending further instruction from the county magistrate. Those instructions never came. The railway survey was quietly adjusted to curve eastward, avoiding the site entirely. In later interviews, an elderly railman named Samuel Price recalled that night, "We heard the wind catch in the hole like a man sighing. The sheriff said, 'Let the earth keep its own dead,' and ordered it filled back. We did, and not one of us went near again." 2 weeks later, Thacker's crewman, Louis Cardenas, was found dead outside his quarters, his expression contorted, his hands clutching his chest. The attending physician recorded it as a cardiac seizure. Another worker, Henry Doyle, quit the project that same morning, claiming he heard tapping under the soil near the saloon ruins while keeping night watch. Whether these were coincidences or something darker, the effect was the same. The site became a void in the town's memory. Maps redrew the area as undeveloped tract. By 1912, the tracks had bypassed the ruins altogether. Still, the legend survived in fragments. It's said that an officer from Santa Fe, curious about the earlier Lincoln County conflicts, came through Las Cruces in 1913 to collect oral histories from veterans and settlers. In his notes, later catalogued at the University of New Mexico Archives, he mentions one aging drifter named Jacob Miller, who claimed to have known Finch personally. Miller's words, though recorded decades after the fact, still unsettle historians. "He weren't no man built for company, said he'd been with both sides of the Lincoln County War, taking what he needed from whichever was losing. Always clean, never drunk. But you could feel him studying your fear like a preacher studies his text." The officer dismissed Miller's story as frontier myth Yet he preserved the note regardless. Perhaps even then, he sensed there was something in Finch's legend too stubborn to fade, something the desert itself refused to bury. By the time the Great War began in Europe, all who had known the Blood Moon Saloon were gone or dying. But one more account, dated 1916, would resurface, an unsigned letter sent to the Las Cruces Gazette, claiming that the writer had reopened the old site by moonlight and found the soot-marked wall whole again, as though it had never been broken. The letter ends abruptly, ink faded into nothing after the words, "He still waits, where the fear is deepest." The 1916 letter has survived only in partial form. The Las Cruces Gazette kept no copies of that month's issue, but a transcription made by editor Samuel Hart was found in his personal effects after his death in 1931. The handwriting, he noted, was unusually elegant, written in deep brown ink on aged paper, with no signature and no return address. It had been mailed from Silver City, roughly 80 miles west of Las Cruces, postmarked May 2, 1916. Hart's transcription reads in part, "I have walked the ground of that place, and the earth remembers. There is a sound beneath it, soft as a man's last breath. The soot mark still stands. The wall was never gone. I believe it was never meant to be." He dismissed it at first as one of many hoaxes tied to the Blood Moon legend, which had become a small, local curiosity by then. But something about the letter troubled him. The phrasing was too precise, the tone too measured. It read less like a ghost story and more like an affidavit. Hart filed it away, and months later began a short investigative series titled Forgotten Corners of the Territory. His third article revisited the ruins, where he interviewed 2 railway watchmen still stationed near the line. One of them, Albert Ruiz, recalled seeing a stranger that spring. Tall man, black coat, didn't talk, carried a satchel, stayed by the old saloon site 2 nights, left on the 3rd. When I looked later, the ground where he'd stood was dark, like fire had kissed it. Ruiz's statement was recorded and published, but only once. The Gazette's next issue ran a brief correction saying no further investigation warranted. After that, the editor's own name disappeared from the publication's masthead. Hart had resigned and left town. What makes the letter significant is not its mystery, but its references, details consistent with the Lincoln County War period. It mentioned an iron ledger, an unfinished tally, and a man who counted fear instead of coin. Historians later linked these to an unsolved case from 1874 when a traveling accountant from Albuquerque was reported missing en route to Lincoln. His books were recovered near Las Cruces, burned at the edges, as though someone had tried to erase his numbers. In the early 1920s, when the university's folklore department began compiling tales of the southwest frontier, the Blood Moon account was classified as a composite myth, part bandit tale, part ghost legend. But a footnote from Professor Harold M. Wills, dated 1924, betrays unease. All stories contain a seed of truth. If there is fabrication here, it may lie not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Finch's absence from census records is itself an eloquent fact. Even now, no census, no tax file, no death certificate bearing the name Elias Finch has ever been found. The saloon deeds from 1871 list only E. Finch as the purchaser, paid in full, cash in silver. What intrigues researchers most is how the name continues to appear in tavern stories, in soldiers' letters, and in one chilling diary found near Fort Stanton. The diary belonged to Captain Robert Elwell, who served during the Apache campaigns. In an entry from December 1872, he wrote, "Met a man by the road calling himself Finch. He asked not for money nor food, only if I feared the dark. When I said no, he smiled and said, 'Then you're already mine.'" The diary ends 2 days later. Elwell's patrol was ambushed crossing the Jornada del Muerto. Of the 7 men listed, only 1 body was recovered. By the close of 1916, the Blood Moon legend had become more than folklore. It was an infection, quietly spreading through the retellings of those who insisted they'd seen that soot mark with their own eyes. In 1917, the year the United States entered the Great War, few in New Mexico still spoke of the Blood Moon Saloon. Time and industry had smothered the remnants of frontier life, leaving only broken wells and empty lots. Yet, that spring, a new discovery briefly drew the town's attention again. A ledger book, unearthed by ranch hands repairing a fence near the abandoned railway spur east of Las Cruces. The book was badly weathered, its leather warped and half-melted from sun exposure. Inside, most pages were blank, but near the center were several entries written in a slanted, deliberate hand. The handwriting matched no local record, yet the entries bore a chilling familiarity to those who remembered the Blood Moon story. Each line began with a date and a single word, fear, followed by a series of tallies, slashes and dots, uneven but counted. One page read simply, May 4th, 1873, fear, 9. 2 spoke, 1 sang, none forgiven. The ledger was delivered to the county office by a foreman named Ernest Poole, who described finding it inside a collapsed section of ground as though the earth itself had coughed it up. Within days, the ledger disappeared from the clerk's desk. No inventory tag was filed. A year later, when a new clerk reorganized the archives, he found a folded sheet tucked into an envelope marked Unprocessed Evidence. It contained a single torn page from that ledger, with faint stains along its edge. The clerk, assuming it was water damage, noted in the margin, ink appears brown, but flakes red. That detail would haunt researchers decades later. The handwriting on the surviving page was examined in 1937 by Professor Harold M. Wills, the same folklorist who had annotated the Blood Moon tales a decade earlier. His analysis, archived in the university's Southwestern Folklore Review, includes this remark. The entries exhibit an obsessive consistency common to myth. The notion that fear could be measured numerically suggests either mental disturbance or deliberate symbolism. The tone is devoid of remorse, as though emotion itself were being catalogued. Wills speculated the ledger could have belonged to Finch, describing it as a primitive account of a conscience. He compared it to reports from the Lincoln County War, where hired gunmen occasionally kept tallies of bounties and kills. But these marks didn't align with bounties or names. Only the recurring word fear. Even more disturbing, faint pencil sketches appeared between the columns. A crescent moon, a flame, and what seemed to be an eye drawn within a circle. The last entry, partially legible, read, The count continues. The room remembers. After the ledger's rediscovery, locals began to revisit old rumors. Some said Finch had been a deserter from the war, a man who'd turned to outlawry. Others believed he was never a soldier at all, just a figure who appeared wherever fear was strongest, from the frontier raids to the saloon killings that went unrecorded. A Las Cruces preacher, Reverend Abel Greer, gave a sermon that year condemning those who traffic in dread. His notes, preserved by his daughter, include this passage. The devil does not demand worship, only attention. Those who feed upon terror grow hollow, and the hollow man lives on fear as others do bread. Whether or not he meant Finch, the implication was clear. When the preacher's chapel burned to the ground the following winter, some called it coincidence. Others whispered that the fire had started in the cellar, where Greer kept a box of notes labeled simply Blood Moon. By 1918, the world's fear was elsewhere, in Europe's trenches and telegrams from the dead. But in the desert towns of New Mexico, the locals swore the wind carried a different echo, the creak of a saloon door that hadn't stood for 40 years. When the Great War ended in 1918, the towns of southern New Mexico slipped into uneasy quiet. Soldiers returned to find their homes swallowed by dust, their families scattered, and their fears replaced by silence. Yet in Las Cruces, silence carried a different weight. It was not peace, it was absence, as though something once listening had gone still. That winter, A retired telegraph operator named Clinton Rhodes took up lodging near the old railway bend, close to the site of the Blood Moon ruins. He'd come west for the dry air, hoping to ease his failing lungs. In his journal, now housed in the State Historical Archives, he recorded nights of wind that did not move the trees but hummed through the ground like a low wire. Rhodes, being a man accustomed to the subtleties of sound, began experimenting. He placed glass bottles along his windowsill and tuned them to different pitches. On several nights between January and March of 1919, he wrote of one bottle that would sing without wind, producing a faint, wavering tone between midnight and dawn. He traced the vibration to the soil beneath his house, directly over the line of the old Saloon foundation. "The sound," he wrote, "comes as though from a throat too dry to breathe. I have heard Morse all my life, but these pulses are not code. They are rhythm, like heartbeat or footstep." Local farmers dismissed his claims, yet several corroborated the phenomenon. A rancher named Eddie Lomas told the El Paso Herald in 1920 that his horses refused to cross the old road at night, ears twitching like they're hearing something underfoot. The paper published a short column titled "The Singing Ground of Las Cruces." It framed the story as harmless curiosity, likening it to gas leaks or shifting groundwater. But Rhodes' later entries turned darker. He described waking to find his bottles shattered, as though struck from within, chasse, and a fine dust coating his floorboards, smelling faintly of burnt iron. He wrote one final note before his death in the spring of 1921. "The sound has changed. It breathes now, soft and wet, like someone remembering how." Rhodes was found seated at his desk, ink still wet on the page, the open window facing the ruins. The coroner's report listed natural causes. After his passing, the property reverted to county ownership. The inspector who entered the house weeks later described the soil near the window as unnaturally disturbed, though no sign of digging was evident. His official note, buried among the county's mundane paperwork, contains one strange sentence: "Impression of heel print in clay, smaller than average, pointing inward." By then, the war's end had drawn scholars back to New Mexico in search of untouched folklore. Among them was Professor Harold M. Wills, returning for what would be his final study. Having already documented the Blood Moon tales a decade earlier, Wills hoped to close the file by tracing them to a single verifiable event. Instead, he found new testimony, accounts of the hum, the bottles, and the sound beneath the soil. Wills's last notebook, discovered after his death in 1923, contains one haunting observation. Perhaps fear is not what Finch took, but what he left behind. The residue of dread absorbed by wood, stone, and time. The saloon may be gone, but the ledger is still open. The connection to the Lincoln County War, those years of betrayal, murder, and vigilante justice, became clearer to Wills in those final pages. He proposed that Finch was not an outlaw in the traditional sense, but a remnant of that moral decay, a man shaped by violence until he learned to feed from it. Wills's notes end abruptly, mid-sentence. "I hear it now, even in daylight. No one knows where he was buried. His effects were boxed, mislabeled, and even duly misplaced. But one item reportedly found among them was a revolver with a silver handle, engraved faintly with a crescent moon. In 1924, a janitor cleaning the storerooms of the University of New Mexico's folklore department stumbled upon a locked tin box beneath a shelf of misfiled student papers. It was dented, unlabeled, and sealed with a loop of rusted wire. The key was found taped beneath the lid of a nearby desk, wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated the previous year. Inside were the final belongings of Professor Harold M. Wills, a man whose curiosity had devoured his peace and many believed his sanity. The contents were few: a cracked magnifying lens, several small notebooks, a silver-handled revolver, and a folded cloth that smelled faintly of smoke. But what chilled the department clerk was the notebook on top. Its first page read, in Wills's tidy script, "To anyone who opens this box, understand that silence is a form of witness. The Blood Moon ledger was never metaphor. It is arithmetic of terror. The following pages were less orderly, scribbles, half-sentences, and sketches. One page bore an illustration of a crescent moon above a door, with annotations describing pressure marks on brick as if from inward hands. Another page contained a crude transcription of what Wills believed to be Finch's voice, based on overlapping witness accounts. He wrote, "Low register, unaccented, no drawl, no tremor, the way one reads scripture without belief." 2 pages later, he referenced a field recording he'd attempted to make in early 1923, an experiment using a wax cylinder phonograph to capture the supposed subterranean sound beneath the Saloon ruins. The cylinder, he claimed, had cracked during playback. His final note on the matter: "The sound is not vibration, it is pulse. The wax could not bear it." That entry aligns with a letter discovered decades later in the university's mail archive, addressed to Wills from Dr. Charles Denning, a physicist in Santa Fe. Denning wrote in January 1992. 3. Your description suggests infrasound below human hearing. It may explain why witnesses report dread without audible cause. However, such low frequencies cannot originate from shallow soil, unless something beneath resonates intentionally. The phrase "resonates intentionally" became the subject of debate among researchers for years. Was Denning implying an artificial structure? A chamber designed to amplify fear itself? Will's remaining pages offered only fragments, lists of coordinates, sketches of old town layouts, and one eerie repetition written over an entire leaf. Fear measured, fear counted, fear remembered. The revolver in the box was examined briefly before being transferred to the State Museum. It bore the same crescent engraving previously reported on Finch's weapon. Ballistics dated it roughly to the 1870s, matching known manufacturing from Colt's Hartford line, but the barrel was unusually clean, as though never fired. A small tag tied to its trigger guard read, "Returned, not used." The cloth folded beneath it, once white, was streaked with soot and faint prints resembling fingertips. Testing in the 1940s suggested the dark stains were animal blood, though no species was conclusively identified. Following the box's discovery, the folklore department quietly sealed the file. Wills's findings were deemed psychologically unstable, his name scrubbed from future publications. The box was locked again, placed in university storage, and nearly forgotten, until a graduate researcher named Alice Grant requested access in 1952 for her thesis on territorial myths. What she found inside no longer matched the original inventory. The revolver was gone. The soot-stained cloth, too. Only the notebooks remained. Their ink faded to a rust hue. The first line on the opening page had been underlined 3 times in an unsteady hand. "He listens when the wind stands still." Grant resigned from the program the following year and left New Mexico entirely. She never published her thesis. Her advisor later remarked, "She said she could still hear it when the NE." The nights were quiet enough, whatever it was Wills tried to record. By the early 1930s, Las Cruces had grown into a modest railway town, its wild frontier edges smoothed over by modernity. Electric lights lined the streets where once lanterns had burned, and the desert silence was broken by the clatter of trains. Yet, despite progress, locals spoke softly about one stretch of land west of the river, a barren patch where grass refused to grow. That ground, they said, had once been the site of the Blood Moon Saloon. During those years, the story resurfaced through oral retellings collected by the Federal Writers Project. One interviewer, Ruth Sandoval, noted in her 1937 field report that residents under 50 often dismissed the tale as old superstition. But the older generation, particularly those whose parents lived through the 1870s, refused to set foot near it. Sandoval quoted one farmer, "Ain't no ghost story, miss. That place ain't haunted. It's hungry." She described the area as unusually quiet, even by desert standards. No birds perched on its fence posts. No crickets sang there at night. Her notes mention an unshakable sense of being listened to, though she added, "Likely suggestion, nothing verifiable. It was Sandoval who first drew connections between the Saloon's legend and older accounts of similar disappearances during the Lincoln County War era. She speculated that Finch might have been part of a vigilante group, perhaps one that turned predatory. In one of her marginal notes, she wrote, "Men of that time took from each other everything they could: land, cattle, breath. Why not fear?" Her fieldwork later inspired a local journalist, James P. Hollister, to revisit the ruins for a human interest piece in the Albuquerque Evening Journal, April 1938. Hollister, a skeptic by reputation, described the site in blunt terms: just dirt, splinters, and silence. Nothing of note except the stillness, which feels deeper than two. He ground should hold. But in his private notes, which were published only after his death, Hollister admitted that his compass spun erratically near the center of the plot, as if metal beneath were moving. He also reported finding fragments of a brick wall faintly blackened, with what appeared to be soot traces forming a crescent pattern. "It's likely nothing more than old burn marks," he wrote. "Still, I felt the hair on my arms rise, without wind, without sound." Those notes remained unpublished until the 1960s, but they revived academic interest in the case. A small circle of historians at the University of Texas at El Paso began compiling all known documents related to Finch, the Blood Moon Saloon, and the subsequent testimonies from the 1870s through Wills's time. The archive that resulted became known informally as the Fear Ledger. Inside were copies of Finch's supposed entries, the soot-marked sketches, and later newspaper accounts. But what startled researchers most was a telegram found among them, dated March 14, 1874, and addressed to a marshal's office in Meseta. It read, "Request immediate inquiry. Finch, alias unknown, stop irregular deaths near Las Cruces. Stop, fear not. Cholera, stop. Citizens demand justice, stop." No record of a reply exists. From that point onward, the story ceased being folklore. It became a subject of quiet inquiry. Those who studied it claimed that each generation, someone new was drawn to that site: a scholar, a journalist, a traveler. And each time, something small went missing afterward: notes, objects, or occasionally the person themselves. When one professor suggested, half in jest, that the legend seemed to consume attention like breath, the phrase caught on. In the archives, it appears written again and again in margin notes and typewritten drafts. He feeds where fear gathers. The collection that would come to be known as the Fear Ledger was first catalogued in 1941, though much of its material predated the war by decades. It was not a formal archive, just a set of boxes kept in the back of a university storeroom, labeled only with pencil and string. Inside were transcripts, news clippings, and carbon copies of letters concerning the Blood Moon Saloon. The project's curator, Dr. Myra Sloan, was a quiet scholar who specialized in Western oral histories. In her introductory notes, she wrote, "This file is less a record of a place than of its echo, an idea that survives by being feared. It is not the ruins we are preserving, but the sensation." Sloan spent nearly a decade trying to separate fact from invention. She traced the earliest verifiable names: Elias Finch, Robert Yancey, Marjorie Lane, Harold Wills, and found that each disappeared from the record under unclear circumstances. Even Finch's supposed silver revolver, once logged by the New Mexico State Museum, had vanished from storage. The tag remained, the weapon did not. In her correspondence with a Smithsonian researcher in 1947, Sloan admitted she could not fully explain the ledger's pull. "Every time I reopen these folders, I feel the same stillness people describe at the site, a pause, not silence but the expectation of sound." That same year she received an anonymous parcel. Inside was a wax cylinder, wrapped in cloth and accompanied by a short note typed on an old Underwood machine. "This is what Wills heard. Play it only once." The cylinder was cracked, but partially intact. Against the advice of her colleagues, Sloan played it on a borrowed phonograph. Witnesses later recalled that the sound began as a low hum, almost mechanical, before fading into something rhythm-like. 3 beats, then 2, repeated slowly. One assistant described it as breathing slowed to patience. The recording ended abruptly with a faint scraping noise, followed by what seemed like a whisper. Sloane's personal diary, dated that night, includes the following entry. The whisper was not a word, but an intake of breath. It felt directed. It knew I was listening. She fell ill within a week, complaining of pressure in the ears and a taste of metal at the back of the throat. Her condition worsened through the summer, and by autumn she had resigned her post. Before leaving, she sealed the entire collection, leaving instructions that it not be reopened for 50 years. Her final note to the university read, "If knowledge can hunger, then I have fed it enough." After her departure, the fear ledger faded from public memory once more. The wax cylinder was never found again. When the boxes were reopened in the 1990s under the Freedom of Information Act, only half remained. The missing materials, mostly field notes and letters, had been replaced by a single envelope containing soot-stained paper. Inside was one line, written in neat script, "He still counts." When the sealed archive of the Fear Ledger was reopened in 1997, 50 years after Myra Sloane's departure, the world outside had changed beyond recognition. But inside those boxes, the air smelled of soot and paper rot, as though the desert had waited with its breath held. The archivist in charge, Dr. Leonard Krauss, described the task as lifting the lid off a rumor. He was a rational man, trained in empirical research, and approached the project with a skeptic's precision. Yet even he noted anomalies, faint discolorations on the cardboard lids, ink that seemed newer than its supposed age, and once the sound of soft friction from inside a sealed envelope before opening. The first document he reviewed was Wills's original inventory, now missing entire pages. What remained still referenced the Lincoln County War, Wills's theory that Finch had been molded by the violence of those years. Krauss underlined one of Wills's final lines. He was not born of darkness, but of habit. Men learn to kill. He learned to savor what precedes it. The phrasing fascinated Krauss. He decided to focus his study on psychological contagion, how fear itself might perpetuate across generations through story and expectation. But within a month, his notes began to take an unexpected tone. One entry from May 1997 reads, "The room is never silent when I read these. There's a low vibration in the walls, steady as breath. Colleagues claim not to hear it." Krauss began visiting the original site west of Las Cruces, where little remained except dry earth and an eroded rail embankment. He took soil samples and photographs, noting that each image showed a faint distortion in the air near the center of the frame, like heat shimmer in cold weather. When he returned the following week, he found one of his camera tripods toppled, half buried, its metal legs etched with a crescent mark. In August, Krauss recorded a brief audio log, the only surviving one from his fieldwork. His voice sounds calm at first, though increasingly strained. No insects, no echo. It's as if sound itself is being drawn into the ground. I can feel pressure beneath my feet. Something rhythmic. 3 beats, then 2, just like the wax cylinder. The log ends with static. Krauss returned to the archive 2 days later, left a resignation letter on his desk, and vanished. His car was found abandoned off the highway near Hatch, New Mexico. Inside was a small bag of soil and a note written on county stationery. He's not in the stories. The stories are in him. After Krauss's disappearance, the university closed the file indefinitely, citing ongoing legal ambiguities regarding private collections. But copies of his recordings circulated quietly among researchers. Some swore they could hear, in the background, a low breath beneath the hum, so faint it might have been the movement of air, or something imitating it. By the turn of the millennium, the Blood Moon legend had become digital folklore. Online forums debated its authenticity, merging fact and fiction. Yet, even stripped of context, one phrase always resurfaced: "He feeds where fear gathers." In Las Cruces, the land itself remained empty, sold, surveyed, and resold, but never built upon. Locals said any who tried found foundations cracking, blueprints misaligned, or workers falling ill. The county simply marked it historical easement and let the desert reclaim it. Still, On windless nights, travelers passing along the old rail line sometimes reported the same unease, the faint sensation of being watched from below and the smell of dust that tastes faintly of iron. By the early 2000s, the Blood Moon Saloon had entered a strange second life, not as a ruin, but as a story without an author. On message boards and early web forums dedicated to frontier hauntings, users traded fragments of the tale: the gunslinger who drank fear, the humming earth beneath Las Cruces, the missing ledger pages. Most had no idea the accounts were rooted in genuine historical records. In 2004, a graduate student at the University of Arizona, Lydia Cross, began researching what she called informational hauntings, legends that persisted through documentation rather than eyewitness testimony. Her dissertation proposal used the Blood Moon case as its centerpiece. She obtained permission to access the remaining university archive materials, the same boxes that had passed through Will's, Sloan, and Krause's hands. Her first letter to the university's review board included a curious observation. "The documents have an ambient pull. I feel the urge to read them aloud, though they were not written to be spoken." Cross digitized hundreds of pages, creating the first organized digital record of the Blood Moon material. She noted subtle distortions during scanning, sections of text that blurred only while under the lens, symbols that seemed to change when viewed in sequence. She dismissed these as scanner artifacts, but included screenshots in her appendices. One image showed a repeating mark in the margins of multiple letters, a faint crescent drawn in soot. In interviews years later, Cross said she began hearing a low hum from her computer tower during the late-night digitization sessions. It matched the rhythm noted in Will's and Krause's reports: 3 beats, then 2. The sound stopped whenever she unplugged the scanner. Her research took an unexpected turn when she discovered a missing file catalogued under audio. Unclassified, 1870s, Las Cruces. It was a partial transfer of Myra Sloan's wax cylinder, labeled Fragment B. She isolated the noise spectrum and discovered subharmonic frequencies consistent with infrasound, the same range that can cause human anxiety and nausea. Her technical report concluded, "It is possible the Blood Moon site produced natural infrasound via underground cavities, inducing fear in witnesses. Finch may have exploited this phenomenon, intentionally or not." The university praised her rational explanation, but Cross herself grew uneasy. In private correspondence to a colleague, she confessed, "Even if natural, something still listens through it. The hum doesn't fade. It waits." A year later, her thesis defense drew a small crowd. When she reached the section analyzing the wax cylinder's waveforms, the speakers emitted a deep rumble, brief, low, and heavy enough to vibrate the floor. The auditorium lights flickered. The recording technician confirmed afterward that the file had no such frequency. Cross completed her defense successfully but declined to publish the work. She withdrew from academia, claiming she was done feeding it. Her digital archive remained on the university's server for less than a year before vanishing in a network migration. Only one mirrored backup survived, preserved on a private hard drive belonging to her supervisor. When the contents were examined in 2012, researchers found every document intact except one folder, titled Fear Ledger Origin. It contained a single corrupted audio file. The name of the file read, "Listen When Wind Stops, MP3. Attempts to recover it resulted in a repeating sequence of 3 low pulses, then 2, followed by a faint intake of breath. A technician monitoring the sound later remarked, "It's like something waiting to finish a sentence." By 2015, interest in the Blood Moon Saloon had grown beyond academia. Amateur historians, ghost hunters, and desert explorers began visiting the supposed coordinates west of Las Cruces, what was now little more than a dry expanse of mesquite and fractured stone. Yet those who went there spoke less of ghosts and more of pressure. Phones lost signal. Recorders malfunctioned. The air, they said, moved without moving. One of the first modern expeditions was led by a documentarian named Noah Briggs, who had followed the legend through newspaper archives and university files. His footage, uploaded to a small online channel, shows the crew setting up thermal cameras and microphones on a calm autumn night. Around midnight, The wind dies entirely. The recording captures a faint, low sound, 3 pulses, then 2, barely audible, until enhanced. Briggs, narrating over the static, says quietly, "We thought it was wind, but the desert doesn't breathe like that." The video ends abruptly, with the crew packing equipment in silence. Briggs later told an interviewer that they had experienced a collective migraine that lasted for hours. His assistant, Mira Escalante, refused to return, claiming that while dismantling the tripods, she saw a thin shadow under the ground, not cast, but contained. By late 2016, a local journalist, Henry Varela, published an article in the Las Cruces Sun News titled, "The Land That Hums." He framed it as regional curiosity, connecting the reports to underground aquifers and sound resonance from passing trains. Yet one line in his article drew attention. No train passed that night, yet the sound came from beneath the soil, steady as a sleeping heart. Varela's piece revived the legend briefly online, attracting the attention of Dr. Lydia Cross, who by then had been living in quiet seclusion in Tucson. She agreed to a phone interview for a radio segment. Bayan spoke for the first time in over a decade. Her voice, described by listeners as measured but weary, recounted her academic experience. Every researcher thinks they can isolate the legend, cut it from the ground. But the ground remembers. It's not haunted. It's archived. Fear leaves residue, like light on old film. She ended with a sentence that still circulates among enthusiasts. "If you listen too long, you join the record." A week after the broadcast, the station received a small padded envelope addressed only with a crescent symbol. Inside was an audio cassette labeled "For Continuity." The recording, later analyzed by technicians, contained a single 22-second tone, so low it bordered silence. When amplified, it revealed a faint cadence identical to the old wax cylinder rhythm, 3 beats, then 2. At the very end, a voice, not male or female, flat and calm, whispered 5 words. Ledger open. Fear still counted. After that incident, both the recording and envelope vanished from the station's archive. Varela resigned a month later and relocated out of state. He never wrote again. In the years that followed, the Blood Moon site was officially fenced off by the county after an exploratory dig collapsed into a shallow sinkhole. Workers described finding compacted layers of soot and bone-colored dust, though no full remains. The pit was refilled, the area marked unstable terrain. Still, travelers passing through Las Cruces continue to report a peculiar phenomenon. On moonlit nights when the wind stalls, the desert hush deepens until sound itself feels absent, yet something beneath the stillness begins to count. Locals say it's only the shifting soil. Others claim it's the ledger, balancing itself at last. In 2018, the University of New Mexico authorized a limited field study titled Project Night Archive, an interdisciplinary effort to document acoustic anomalies across the state's desert ruins. Though the program's intent was scientific, several participants quietly admitted they joined for one reason: to investigate the Blood Moon site. The team consisted of 3 acousticians, 1 historian, and a folklore student, Eleanor Finch, no known relation to the Gunslinger, though the coincidence drew nervous jokes among the crew. Their objective: record infrasound patterns, soil movement, and atmospheric resonance near the fenced area west of Las Cruces. On June 3, 2018, they set up sensors across a 2-mile grid, beginning at sundown. Initial readings were unremarkable: steady winds, ambient temperature fluctuations, but just past midnight, every device registered an identical vibration, deep, uniform, and distinctly rhythmic, 3 pulses, then 2. The lead acoustician, Dr. Adrian Holt, described it in his field log. Resonance at 17 Hz, not seismic, not wind-induced. Pattern persists despite calibration. The earth appears to breathe. 2 minutes later, the microphones overloaded. Something between a hum and a human exhale filled the recording band. Holt ordered all equipment shut down, assuming interference. Yet even after power cut, The hum continued faintly in the ground, perceptible through touch. Eleanor Finch later recounted in her personal journal, "I pressed my palm to the sand and felt a pulse, not vibration, but heartbeat. When I removed my hand, I smelled burnt metal. By dawn, the sound was gone." Holt stored the recordings on a single encrypted drive, intending to analyze them in the university lab. But when he played them back 3 days later, all data from the final hour had vanished, replaced by a single file named Ledger Returned. The file contained Ned faint static, and buried beneath it, a whisper, repeating in broken intervals. "Count. Fear. Fear. Count." Forensic analysis suggested the waveform matched no human voice. The inflection lay below the range of normal speech, closer to subharmonic vibration than language. Holt, a pragmatic man, dismissed it publicly as data corruption. Privately, he confessed to colleagues that the repetition appeared too structured to be random. In an internal email later leaked online, he wrote, "There's intelligence in the rhythm. It corrects itself. If I isolate the waveform, it anticipates my edits." Within a month, Project Night Archive was quietly discontinued, officially citing funding issues. The participants were reassigned. However, several years later, in 2021, a university server migration revealed that Holt had continued the research independently. A hidden directory contained hours of unlisted recordings labeled only by lunar phase. On the one titled Blood Moon, 4:17 a.m., a faint voice can be heard beneath the ambient noise. "I was never gone." That fragment reignited interest in the legend, particularly because the timestamp coincided with a lunar eclipse visible that night over southern New Mexico. The coincidence revived whispers of ritual timing, though most experts dismissed it as chance. Eleanor Finch, now a researcher herself, declined interviews, but left one cryptic note in her online publication. "Some ruins are not abandoned. They are listening posts. The Blood Moon Ledger was never about one man. It's about the act of recording itself. Fear leaves impressions, and impressions remember." Her phrasing echoed nearly word for word a line written by Professor Wills almost a century earlier. It was as though the story had completed its circuit. What began as a saloon ledger in 1871 had become a mirror that recorded those who tried to study it. The hidden and beneath the desert had found new listeners. By 2022, the Blood Moon Saloon no longer existed in the physical world, only as coordinates, academic fragments, and a growing body of digital folklore that refused to die. Yet the desert itself seemed unwilling to let the legend end. That spring, county workers performing a land survey west of Las Cruces reported that one of their drone cameras malfunctioned repeatedly over a single rectangular stretch of soil. Reviewing the footage later, they found a frame showing a faint crescent pattern, darker than the surrounding sand, visible only for a second before static overtook the feed. The lead surveyor, Miguel Alvarez, submitted the anomaly report, but added in handwriting at the bottom, "When reviewing playback, I heard breathing, mine and something slower beneath it." His supervisor dismissed the note as fatigue, but Alvarez, curious, returned alone 2 weeks later. GPS logs confirm his last transmission from the site at 9:43 p.m. His truck was discovered at dawn, engine running, headlights facing the ruins. The driver's door stood open, and inside the cab, survey maps had been arranged neatly on the seat. On one, the ink of a crescent had been traced over and over until it tore through the paper. That same week, Dr. Lydia Cross, by now reclusive, living quietly under another name, emailed a former colleague a single message: "He's counting again." No one ever heard from her after that. When county police searched the Blood Moon area for Alvarez, they reported a strange stillness that night. No insects, no distant traffic, no wind. The official search log notes, "Team reported auditory distortion consistent with subsonic resonance. Team lead experienced nausea and temporary disorientation. Site cleared pending geological review." Unbeknownst to the searchers, a weather satellite captured a low-resolution thermal image of the area hours later. The photograph, public, available for only a brief period before being removed from the database, shows a circular heat plume roughly 20 meters wide, pulsing faintly with irregular rhythm. Researchers later compared it to underground gas activity. Locals disagreed. A retired railman, Carlos Montoya, who'd worked near that same stretch decades earlier, told a local interviewer, "Every so many years, the ground hums again. It's not ghosts. It's the breath of what we left buried. Maybe Finch was just the first to hear it proper." What followed blurred fact and story once more. Amateur explorers, lured by social media, began sneaking past the warning signs to camp near the coordinates. Their footage, grainy, disjointed, often filmed by flashlight, shows consistent patterns: static interference, compass failure, and moments of silence so deep the microphones flattened to nothing. One widely circulated clip captured a voice just before the feed cut. "Ledger full. Begin again." Skeptics called it an audio overlay. Others noted that the voice carried the same calm cadence described by witnesses over a century earlier, what Professor Wills once called scripture without belief. Soon after the video spread, the site was declared restricted under cultural preservation law. The public statement cited unstable terrain and environmental hazard, but the accompanying internal memo, later leaked, mentioned unexplained subharmonic activity. Within months, fencing went up. Access was banned. The desert returned to silence, or so it seemed. For those living nearby, the phenomenon had shifted. They began hearing the pulse not in the ground, but in their walls, their wind chimes, their sleep. Dogs whined at empty doorways. Water glasses trembled without reason. One resident described it perfectly. "It's like someone beneath the house remembering your heartbeat." Whatever had begun under the blood, Moon Saloon in 1871 had transcended timber and soil. It had become something broader, a rhythm etched into New Mexico's air itself, patient, methodical, waiting for new fear to count. In 2023, a collector of Western memorabilia named Darren Hogue purchased an unmarked box of tintypes and daguerreotype plates at an estate sale in Santa Fe. Most were cracked portraits of unknown faces, miners, families, soldiers, but one plate stood apart. Its surface was dark, the silver unevenly tarnished, and scrawled on the back, in a hand almost invisible to the naked eye, were the words, "Blood Moon, 1871. Hogue cleaned the plate gently and scanned it under magnification. What emerged chilled, even hardened historians. It showed a man standing in front of what appeared to be a saloon facade, weathered but faintly legible. Blood Moon Saloon. The man's expression was stern, motionless, his eyes so sharp they seemed to reflect light even through the decades. He held a revolver with a crescent on its handle. At first, Hogue assumed it was staged, a promotional portrait from the era, but deeper inspection revealed inconsistencies. The light direction opposite the shadows, the faint blur around the man's edges, and, most unsettling, a dark shape behind the window glass, like a figure facing inward rather than out. Hogue sent the image to the New Mexico Historical Society for authentication. 2 days later, he received an email reply containing no analysis, only a single sentence. "Do not attempt further cleaning." The plate was returned to him wrapped in a new envelope. Beneath the paper, he found a second tintype that hadn't been part of his original lot. It was blank except for a faint crescent etched in the emulsion. That night, Hogue reportedly left his home in a hurry, driving south toward Las Cruces. His phone's GPS log ends near the old railway grade, the same perimeter where Surveyor Alvarez disappeared. His vehicle was found 3 days later with the ignition off and the camera equipment neatly packed in the passenger seat. The Blood Moon plate was gone. Authorities chalked it up to theft. But when Hogue's assistant examined his home computer, she discovered a folder of recently processed images. One, labeled Frame 6, appeared normal at first glance. Yet when digitally enhanced, faint shapes became visible in the background. 3 men and two women seated around a table, all unsmiling, their faces pale as smoke. Behind them stood a figure whose eyes mirrored those in the 1871 portrait. Metadata confirmed the photo had been scanned less than 24 hours before Hoag vanished. The image circulated quietly among academics until Eleanor Finch, the former Knight Archive researcher, recognized the alignment of the figures. She compared it to floor plans recovered from the original county deed records. The position of each person matched the layout of the Blood Moon Saloon's lower cellar, the chamber that had supposedly been sealed and rediscovered multiple times over the previous century. Her report, unpublished but referenced in later discussions, ended with this reflection. The photograph does not show ghosts. It shows a room remembering its occupants. Memory, like silver nitrate, reacts to exposure. One final note appeared at the bottom of her file, typed in faint gray ink. If Finch ever existed, he was not man nor myth. He was function. The ledger was never his. It was ours. By late 2023, the image had vanished from every official archive. Yet digital copies persisted in scattered corners of the internet, often appearing under file names that seemed to rewrite themselves. Ledger alive.jpg, counting now. TIFF moonreturns.ppng. Those who opened the files reported strange artifacts, audio distortion, faint whispering when viewed through certain editing software. One user described the sound as breathing made of static. Another wrote simply, "He blinked." By 2024, the Blood Moon legend had drifted once more from history into rumor, re-emerging on fringe podcasts and late-night forums. But for one historian, Dr. Samuel Crane, it was unfinished business. Crane specialized in American folklore that blurred with real violence, stories where history and haunting were indistinguishable. The Finch case, he said, was the most articulate ghost the frontier ever made. In March, Crane traveled to Las Cruces with a small team of postgraduate assistants to verify surviving landmarks. Using ground-penetrating radar, they identified irregular cavities beneath the area once mapped as the Saloon site, overlapping voids roughly 6 feet apart, like air pockets in compacted soil. Crane's notes, later recovered from his laptop, describe a strange coherence to the pattern. These are not random. The voids form the crescent. The chamber outline matches the 1874 blueprint almost perfectly. On April 2nd, they began limited excavation. 3 feet down, their spades struck glass, fragments of old bottles and metal fixtures blackened by fire. Then, deeper, they uncovered the corner of a charred beam etched faintly with symbols, crescents and vertical lines. Crane recorded in his log that the marks resembled Finch's supposed ledger tallies. At dusk, the team decided to pause until morning. They covered the pit and packed their gear. But the student technician, Anya Morales, remained briefly to photograph the site. Her final frame shows the pit, half-shadowed, with what appears to be a thin mist rising from its base. The timestamp reads 1903, though she claimed the sun had already set. Her last audio note from that night captures her whisper. Something's breathing under there. Not wind, not echo. At 7:45 p.m. she called Crane, her voice calm but strained. "You'll want to see this," she said. Then the call ended mid-sentence when Crane returned with 2 others. The pit was empty. No sign of Morales or her equipment. Only her footprints remained, ending abruptly at the edge of the hole. Authorities treated it as a cave-in, though the soil showed no collapse. Crane filed a statement describing what he'd seen in the remaining photographs. Faint impressions on the sand, 5 parallel marks curving inward, like the outline of a hand pressed from below. He left New Mexico 2 weeks later, resigned his university post, and vanished from public life. A package bearing his name arrived at the New Mexico Historical Society 6 months afterward. Inside were his notes, sealed in wax, with a brief letter attached. The ledger is not an object. It's the act of remembering fear, and the ground has perfect memory. The attached USB drive contained 1 audio file. The waveform, when analyzed, matched the infrasound patterns recorded in 2018 by the Knight Archive team, the same 3-pulse, 2-pulse rhythm repeating steadily for 4 minutes. But halfway through, something new emerged beneath the hum, the clear click of a revolver being cocked, followed by a whisper of breath. At the file's end, a voice, faint, toneless, unmistakably human, spoke a final phrase. Blood counts best in silence. The museum staff archived the file, labeling it unverified audio, do not replicate. Still, copies leaked online within days. Listeners reported nausea, headaches, and in some cases, sleep paralysis after replaying it. A few claimed they heard the rhythm continue faintly even after the speakers were unplugged. One anonymous comment beneath a reposted version of the file read, "He's not coming back. He never left." By late 2024, the desert west of Las Cruces looked unchanged to anyone passing through. Flat land, dry scrub, and the shimmer of heat that makes the horizon waver like memory. No signpost remained to mark where the Blood Moon Saloon had once stood. The county fence was rusting, its warning placards half buried in sand. Yet those who lived nearby swore the place still breathed at night. The last official mention came from a road maintenance crew that stopped their work after their equipment repeatedly lost power along the stretch nearest the old rail embankment. The supervisor filed a brief report that ended with the sentence, "Sound of wind underground, though no wind present." 3 weeks later, a storm crossed the region, rare lightning over the Jornada del Muerto basin. The flash illuminated what one traveler described as an outline glowing red in the dirt, shaped like a crescent. Photos taken that night were grainy and overexposed, but one image, enhanced by analysts, seemed to show faint vertical marks within the crescent, as if tally lines drawn by heat itself. Within days, the storm scoured the land clean again. Local radio carried small talk about it for a week before the story faded, replaced by more ordinary news. But in January 2025, a researcher cataloging oral histories for a regional heritage project recorded an elderly rancher, Luis Ortega, who spoke softly of the hum still heard after dark. "My father told me his father heard it too, long before the wars, long before the tracks came. Said the ground down there never emptied itself. It listens. You can hear it between breaths if you're still enough." When asked if he believed the story of the gunslinger who drank fear, Ortega only shrugged. Maybe he was a man once. Maybe he was what the land made of a man. Some things the desert keeps because no church will take them. In the background of that interview, faint static rises on the tape. 5 pulses, uneven but familiar. The archivist who reviewed it noted mechanical interference. Still, the rhythm matched the same pattern traced from 1871 onward. 3 beats, then 2. What began as a rumor, a saloon, a missing woman, a quiet man with silver eyes, had become something larger than any one witness or year. It was repetition given form, the ledger itself written into the body of New Mexico's dust. Each generation found its own way to reopen it, a spade in the ground, a recording, a photograph, and each time the counting resumed. In the sealed collections of the University of New Mexico, among the few surviving relics of the Fear Ledger, sits a single page in an anonymous hand. It bears no title, only a date and the faint imprint of soot. The words read, "Fear is not forgotten when its witness survives. The ledger stays open until silence is pure." At the bottom corner, a small crescent is drawn in fading ink. No one knows who placed it there or when. Some archivists claim the mark was always on the paper. Others insist it appears darker each year, as though freshly made. The room where it's kept is temperature-controlled, yet visitors say they feel a slight vibration through the floor, too steady to be pipes, too patient to be coincidence. When the night is still enough, they say the hum returns, soft as breath, low as prayer. And though no walls of the Blood Moon Saloon remain, the desert still waits, counting softly, faithfully, endlessly, as if listening for the next name to enter its record,